Okay, today we're talking about the Great Revelation, and it's kind of part two of, I didn't know how many parts I would do on this, but I'm dealing with a metaphysical interpretation of a couple of stories about Jacob and Esau from the Old Testament. And I decided to settle on two. This would be the last one. It can go on for a long time because there's a lot of events in their lives. But mainly just to refresh all your thinking on what a metaphysical interpretation is. Metaphysical sounds like a pretty big word, $3 word. It really means spiritual. It means beyond the physical, that we acknowledge, a metaphysical interpretation would acknowledge a reality beyond the physical. And in the case of the Bible, it would actually be more accurate to designate it meta-literal, beyond the literal meaning of the Bible. And what we mean by it is we take a biblical story, we look at the meanings of the names of the individuals that are involved, and all of them their names had meaning back then, and the meanings were attached to some event around their birth, or for some reason they would be named something. Their name would mean something more than what ours means now. And I mean, in terms of maybe you were given a name that means something in terms of the actual definition. But it's a much different setting then than now. The way we think of, how do you name a child today? You probably go online and you find a baby name website, and you go through until you find one that you like. And maybe you like it because it reminds you of great-grandmother or whatever. It may have meaning in that sense. But back then, it was the baby was not named right away because they would see what would develop around it sometimes. And sometimes it was named right away because the situation was clear that whatever meaning they gave applied at that moment. So anyway, you go into a book like Charles Fillmore's Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. It's a great resource for finding the Hebrew meaning of any name in the Bible. So I use that when I do a metaphysical interpretation. And also names of places, same thing. They're named, a well will be named a certain thing because of some activity that happened around it. So names mean something. So you look at the meaning of the name, and then you look at the action in the story. And you take all of these things combined, and these represent activity of consciousness. So as I gave the illustration of the Red Sea, the Red Sea with Moses and the Israelites running out of Egypt being pursued by the Egyptians, you can try to make history out of that, as people do. Although, as I pointed out, the Egyptian archives don't mention an exodus like this, of this magnitude. You can look at it as history, you can try to do that, and that's what so many people do today. Or you can look at it as elements of your own consciousness. The Red Sea is something that's standing in your way, and what usually stands in our way is fear. The Egyptians coming up behind us, we're looking at all of these things that aren't working, all these reasons why I should be afraid. And these are elements of consciousness. The Israelites that are reacting in fear, that's our general knee-jerk reaction to a situation that seems to be larger than we are. But Moses, who represents an understanding of God as law, says, take your eyes off of the problem, off of the appearance. First of all, fear not. Check that reaction. That's not the way to handle this issue. We're talking about our own consciousness. Fear not. That's the first step. Lift up your eyes. Take your eyes off the problem and see the salvation that the Lord will work for you this day. That's see the end result that you want, not the thing that you fear most. So that's an activity that takes place in our consciousness. And that, to me, means a lot more than trying to figure out how did those Israelites get across that muddy Red Sea once it was opened up. There's all kinds of logistical problems that are raised when we see that. And why wouldn't the Egyptians record such a huge loss? Their whole army goes out and gets swallowed up by the Red Sea, and yet nothing is said about it. And they were meticulous in their archiving. So this is a Hebrew perspective. But anyway, that's what a metaphysical interpretation is. It's taking a story and applying it to our consciousness, seeing how we can apply it to our consciousness. Now the question is raised, and I've heard this raised over 40 years that I've been doing this, was the Bible written as a metaphysical treatise? Was it intended to be thought of not as an historical document, but as elements of our own consciousness? That's how Charles Fillmore, our co-founder of Unity, treated it. He believed that the writers were metaphysicians, that they wrote these stories the way they did to illustrate the evolution of the human soul. I don't agree with this. And I think it undermines the Hebrew, what their purpose was, who they were, why they were writing what they were writing, why they were treating these historical moments, at least elements of historical moments, in the way they do. So the first question we have to ask is not, is this a metaphysical treatise, but what was this Hebrew trying to say? Why were they writing this way? Why did they depict the story in this way? You can take any story in the Old Testament and read it and guaranteed it's not history. It doesn't follow history. It obviously is grounded in history, and that's what makes it so tantalizing in terms of trying to make an historical document out of it. The characters that are mentioned probably existed. But the way the story unfolds, what the Hebrew is doing is saying, here's how God is interacting with our people. No historian would write that way, but the Hebrew writers would. That was their whole purpose, what God's intention is for our people. So they would take an historical event and they would inject God into it, like if the Israeli army went out and was defeated, that writer would interpret that as, well, is because you all messed up, you sinned, and God is putting you in your place. But an historian would not say that. They would never inject this divine element, but the Hebrew would, and that's what the Bible is. That's what the Old Testament is. It is how the Hebrew sees God interacting historically with Israel. And that is, and all the various sects and elements of the Jew, the Hebrew. And then it's taken on into the Christian level as well. But to understand the Bible, you first have to understand the Hebrew. You have to understand why it was written, what they had in mind, and then we can interpret it however we want. We can draw lessons from it that maybe the Hebrew wasn't even aware of. But to say that that's why he wrote it, we're making these writers metaphysicians when they were really not. Because everything can be metaphysically interpreted. When you have a dream, that's basically what you're doing when you try to figure out what that dream means. You can be looking at these very weird activities in the dream that seem very natural when you're dreaming. You wake up and maybe it seems natural for a few moments and you start thinking about it. That couldn't possibly happen. But what does it mean? So you try to figure out, and people like Carl Jung and great psychologists placed a lot of credibility in dreams if you know how to interpret them. But that's the key, is interpretation. And I'm always a little bit skeptical about that, because an interpretation is just that. It's an interpretation. Sometimes it's how I want to see a thing, not how it is. So sometimes dreams that I have, they're very clear what the meaning is. It may be a totally bizarre series of events that unfold in the dream, but it makes sense on something I'm going through at that moment. And so I can interpret it in a way that it does, it's a message. And it can be a valuable thing. But so that we have to be careful when we're dealing with the Bible in this regard, because the fundamentalist doesn't care. They say the Bible is the Word of God, period. No argument. And that's erroneous. It's not the Word of God, it's the word of the people that wrote it. And that has nothing to do, in many cases, with God. It's their interpretation of God. And so the fundamentalists will say God dictated this body of literature to special humans, and they then in turn gave it to us. That's how God communicates. You want to know what God thinks, read the Bible. You'll find it there someplace. There's an answer to everything. So that's incorrect also. So we have to be careful that we don't duplicate what the fundamentalist does, the same mistake. Only we say, well, it's not to be taken literally, it's metaphysical. That's what he meant. That's what the writer was trying to say. It's not true either. We can look at it that way. And that's what I always like to preface any interpretation I give. Here's a way we can look at it, not here's what the writer meant. When you get into that kind of language, you're crossing a line. And that's why we have so many Christian sects, so many Jewish sects, so many sects of every kind. There's a lot of sects going on in our society. It's just pretty amazing. But it's because we don't understand what the Hebrew, we have to let the Hebrew be the Hebrew, okay? And we start there, see what he or she was trying to say, and it's probably a he, generally, based on the culture. And then we see what we can get out of it. And when we start interpreting metaphysically, the Bible is rich with stories, just like we're talking about here, about the Moses thing, that can actually be very helpful to us. But let's keep in mind, this is an interpretation, not what was intended to be. So we read the Bible in different ways. We ask, what was the Hebrew trying to say? What can we get out of it? It's two levels right there, and there's many more than that. But so the previous lesson, we saw that Esau, we're talking about these two twin brothers, Esau and Jacob. Esau born first. Jacob, they said, had a hole of his heel, came right out on the heels of Esau, literally. And they were very different people. Esau represents the physical aspect of our consciousness. He was called the hairy man. Said even as a baby he was covered with red hair. Like an orangutan, I guess. Well, Jacob represents the mental side that is awakening to the spiritual dimension. Okay, now we're getting into interpretation, but not really, because that's what the story says. Esau was a hunter, a very physically oriented person. Jacob said dwelt in the tents. He was a smooth person, meaning he was not an outdoorsman. So we would say we have a physical representation, Esau, the hunter, and we have the dweller in tents, the smooth guy, in the tent surfing the net, doing whatever they do. Two different kinds of mentalities. So that's our cue as interpreters to say, okay, we've got two things going on here in this story. So in a moment of hunger, Esau swears that he will sell his birthright to Jacob. Esau, the firstborn, even though it was just a few seconds, he would inherit the wealth of the family. And he comes in from a day of hunting. He's famished, and Jacob's cooking some pottage, lentil pottage. And Esau says, I'd really like some of that. I'm starving to death. Jacob says, promise me, swear to me, that you will sell me your birthright. And Esau says, well, I'm about to die, so what difference does it make? Yeah, go ahead, we'll shake on it. So they did. They made that agreement. So Esau swears he will sell his birthright to Jacob. When the time comes to bestow the birthright on his firstborn, father Isaac, now nearly blind, is deceived by his wife Rebekah into believing he is giving Esau this important blessing when in fact it is Jacob disguised as Esau. What Rebekah does, the mother, she favors Jacob, the smooth one, the intellectual. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in just a moment. She favors him, and so she wants him to have the birthright. And the birthright means you lord over the entire family. The family becomes basically your, not your slave, but your servant. They do what you say. Not only do you inherit all the sheep and the cattle and the wealth of the family, you inherit the authority to call the shots. So Rebekah has the insight to see that Esau, this worldly, materialistic, physical guy, doesn't really have the wherewithal to do this important job. But Jacob does. And so she helps him deceive Isaac into giving the birthright, and Isaac is going blind. And so Jacob goes in to the tent Rebekah gets him one of Esau's robes, because he knows that when he goes in, that Isaac will smell that and he'll know the difference. You ever notice how you can tell the difference in people just by hearing footsteps, like family members or so forth? It's different ways to do it, but that's what the story says. And because Esau was a hairy man, Rebekah takes the wool of a lamb and puts it on his forearm, has him hold it up to his father, who's blind and can't see. So the father's feeling his arm, and he's sniffing him and going through the holes. And the father is skeptical. Isaac is skeptical. But he's convinced finally that Jacob is Esau, and he gives him his blessing. So that's a deception. You've got Rebekah carrying out this deception, helping carry out this deception. And she says, you can put the blame on me. She says that. Because Jacob is very uncomfortable with deceiving his father. She says, well, you can just put the blame on me. There's a reason for that. So Rebekah is the mother of twins. Metaphysically, she represents the soul. She represents your soul, my soul. So we have this soul, this higher level of being. All of us have it. We have a physical mentality. We've got an identity that's built around this physical body. And we have one that is built around the unfolding spiritual awareness that we are all undergoing. We have an Esau and we have a Jacob. Our soul knows we are not physical beings. It knows we have a body, but we are not a body. We are not the physical identity. There's something more to us, and it is the intellectual side that carries that on. It begins to develop the understanding and the ideas that allow a spiritually based consciousness to be formed. It's not the body-based identity that develops the spiritual consciousness. It is the intellectual side. But Jacob is not enlightened at this stage. The intellect is not enlightened. He's a youth. But the soul knows. And that's your soul, and my soul has always been pushing for this awakening. It's the thing that brought us to a place like this. It's the thing that brought us to the literature that we read, that we're drawn to, of a spiritual nature. It's a thing that took me out of the fundamental Christian community and put me into a metaphysical community, one that's more spiritually based, and I say that in a very specific meaning, not in a look down my nose at others, but in a sense that acknowledges that the presence of God is within me and it's unfolding through my consciousness. And I was once at a place where the fundamentalism made sense, more or less. I don't know if I ever totally bought it all. But Rebekah, my soul, has been pushing. There's more to it than that, more to it than that. That side of you can't handle what you need to be able to handle in developing a spiritual consciousness. So the deception on one level is a deception, and that's what's interesting about the Old Testament writers, is they have the characters do some pretty nasty things to each other, but it's okay because it's all in the name of God. There's a lot of murder, a lot of hurting going on. But when you look at it metaphysically, it has to happen that way. Esau could not inherit the birthright. Your Esau, my body identity cannot inherit what the soul is trying to give. It can't do it. Not even my intellect can do that, but my intellect is the way that the way is prepared. You know, John the Baptist represents the illumined intellect. He prepares the way for the coming of the Christ. Again, a metaphysical interpretation. But it's to be baptized by water. It's an intellectual cleansing as opposed to being baptized by the Spirit. When Jesus was immersed, when John the Baptist baptized him, the story says he was brought out and the Holy Spirit descended on him like a dove. He was born of the Spirit. So it's illustrating two levels of awakening. John the Baptist cannot enter the kingdom of God in the sense that as being an enlightened being, John the Baptist mentality, I should say. It's that part of us that is the reader. It studies, it is preparing our consciousness for a direct revelation. But all the facts, all the spiritual facts that we accumulate don't do it. It simply prepares the mind to receive, to have the actual experience of enlightenment. And that will come in moments, and probably not at a permanent level, but moments of enlightenment where you see a higher truth and you say, I know that's real. And you pursue that, it goes away. Then it comes back. Then it goes away. But you can't read enough books to get that experience. The reading, the intellectual side, prepares the way. The illumined intellect prepares the way for the spiritual birth. So that's the same dynamic we're dealing with here in Jacob and Esau. So when Esau discovers this fraud has been brought about, he swears he's going to kill Jacob. He's very angry. Even though he agreed to do this, And that's, again, the physical side. You know, Esau came in, he was hungry, wanted to deal at the moment with whatever problem he was having, the problem of hunger. He wanted to solve that problem right now. And he'd do anything to solve it. That's our physical, mental, body-based side. Just do anything to get rid of the problem. Let's not study to learn something of the spiritual dimension. Let's use affirmations to get rid of the problem. Just we're not going up, we're going horizontally. We're not solving problems, because we will, if we're not evolving spiritually, consciously, if our consciousness is not evolving, then we keep repeating the same problems, as Freud says, with monotonous regularity. We don't get the principle that allows us to rise above that. So that's a level of dealing with it. But anyway, Esau, his reaction is anger. You know, I solved that problem back then, but then now I've created a bigger problem. But instead of blaming himself, accepting responsibility for himself, he blames his brother for doing it. And he's not entirely wrong, because it was a deception. So when Esau learns of the deception, he vows to kill Jacob. This illustrates the tension between our body-based identity and our spiritually awakening mentality. Jacob flees in fear for his life. In ourselves, there's this tension. We have needs of the body. We need to address those. But we also have this rising spiritual, this pushing that says you're more than the body, you're more than that. So how do I address the spiritual desire that I have while I have all these physical problems that need to be solved? And so what happens, a lot of times we will take spiritual principles and try to apply them to solving our material problems. And that can be an issue that doesn't have a happy ending. We're using spiritual principles not to open our minds, but to pay our bills. And that is only a temporary fix. I can momentarily solve the problem of my hunger, but am I actually rising in my awareness, in my understanding? And that's only a question that we can answer. And we'll all answer it the same way. Of course, I've tried to apply spiritual principles to solve physical needs. It's when we stop there that we run into problems. But that's the whole idea. You know, you can fill your stomach and one day be totally content, but still have this gnawing sense that something's missing, something bigger is, I'm about something bigger. So it's a thing we all deal with. There's a tension going on in us. So Jacob flees. He takes his whole family, goes out, and it's not just him running off. He probably had maybe several hundred people with him. We don't know exactly what he had, but it was quite an entourage. But he is fleeing. He's totally afraid. He's reacting because he knows if Esau tracks him down, he'll kill him. So he goes to sleep at night, and he has this dream, and we're all familiar with that. That's what the painting depicts, Jacob's dream, the angels. There's a ladder reaching to heaven, angels going up and down. The Lord is at the top and begins to speak to Jacob in the dream, saying, "Don't be afraid. I'm with you. I've always been with you. I will always be with you." The Lord assures Jacob that he will be with him always, guiding and protecting him and his descendants. So here's the great revelation. Jacob awakes from his sleep and says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." See, that's the breakthrough that we all have. The Esau side tends to do the bargaining. We think in terms of, we walk the straight and narrow, the Lord will bless us. We do what the Lord wants, we'll make him happy. Jacob and the people around him all believe the Lord dwelt in a specific place. Jacob actually believed he had left the presence of God. He not only left his family, he left the presence of God. And that was another reason for his fear. He's not under divine protection. But he has this dream where he realizes that I did not leave the presence of God. Surely the Lord is in this place and I knew it not. That's omnipresence. That's the revelation of omnipresence. And that's the breakthrough that we make when we take God out of the sky and we put ourselves in God and we put God in us. We realize that wherever I am in my life, God is there. I don't have to make any deals. I don't have to try to persuade God to act in ways that God is not already acting. What changed between the time Jacob went to sleep and the time he woke up, only one thing changed, and that was Jacob. That was his thinking. When he went to sleep, he was out of the presence of the Lord. When he woke up, he was in the presence of the Lord. But the truth is, the Lord was always present because God is omnipresent. So in Hebrew history, this would represent a milestone, a major breakthrough in their understanding of the nature of God. And many scholars will call the Old Testament, it's an evolution of the God idea. That is, we'll see how the Hebrew understood God, the nature of that, change throughout the Old Testament. And this is one of the most significant changes that we see. God is localized. God was on the mountain. Moses went up on the mountain and got the 10 Commandments. That's where God was. Well, Jacob finds out God is not just there, he's wherever he is also. So that's a breakthrough. And we have those kinds of breakthroughs. That's our Jacob side waking up to that deeper reality. That wherever I am, no matter what's happened, Jacob just pulled off this great deception. He hurt somebody. And yet the Lord is there for him. It's the same thing with us. We don't change the behavior of God by how we behave. We behave a certain way and we think we don't deserve the love of God. But God never says that. We say it. We give God human characteristics. God obviously is mad at me because I ran a red light yesterday or whatever. Or I said something that hurt somebody. God does not change. So this is a major breakthrough. And when we have a breakthrough like this, it changes the way we pray. It changes the way we think of God. I'm not trying to earn the right to have a better life. I'm opening myself to that movement of spirit that unfolds as a better life. That's my natural inheritance. And that's what the story is trying to say. That, the Lord is saying to Jacob, basically, I promised this a long time ago, before you were born. This is not something you're starting. You inherit it. It's your divine birthright. So we have to read through the lines, between the lines, when we're reading Hebrew literature, because it's all about the Hebrew. We're not included in these stories. That's a thing we just have to understand. But we are included in them. We're included in every single one of them, especially when we see them from this perspective, this level. So Jacob is in us, Esau is in us, this tension is in us, Rebekah is the soul pushing out. Been talking to us from day one, guiding us to those books we picked up, people we met, situations along the way that have aided us in understanding this whole process. So the ancient Hebrew believed the Lord Yahweh was localized. Jacob thought that by leaving his homeland, he was also leaving the presence of the Lord. But he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. He was the first person to use the word awesome. But in those days, it actually meant something. Not, what did you order? A hamburger. Awesome. You know, that's whatever. So, I mean, that to me is it kind of gives me chills to think of what Jacob was going through. This, how awesome is this place? It's his daily life, his life. He was fleeing, and he realized in his very life is where things are happening. I've said before, if your life was a person and I heard you talk about it all the time, what you would be saying to this person is, well, I like you, but you're not good enough. You got to keep getting better. Got to keep fixing you up. So Jacob is saying, well, my life is just perfect the way it is because this is the house of the Lord. That's a shift in perception that is very important for each one of us to get. Instead of telling your life all the things that are wrong with it, to realize you're perfectly placed for this type of revelation. You have the Jacob side that is able to grasp this. And we're not discarding Esau, because in the long run, they reconcile. They become friends again in the end. And that's symbolic also of how we view the body. It's not the enemy. At the soul level, we know we dwell in the presence of God. As Jacob, our spiritually developing consciousness, begins to get glimpses of this profound truth, we see that God, our spiritual source, is not in some remote location, but is ever present and can never leave us, even in our moments of uncertainty. In his dream, the great wealth promised to Jacob by the Lord symbolizes the spiritual wealth that is in store for each of us. So you see how we can take a story like this, that you would never read this from this point of view until some guy like me comes along and throws it out there. There's many people that do it, of course. But the traditionalist is stuck on the story, the literal story, and there is so much more to it when you look at it from a metaphysical point of view. Did the writer intend that? Probably not. But I think if you told the writer, if the writer was standing here in front of us and said, here's a way we can look at what you wrote, I don't think he would disagree. I think he would think that was marvelous. Okay? So we will pick up something. I'm going to introduce you next week to our extended family. We just adopted 4 feral cats. A mother and 3 babies. I adopted sort of the mother first. I told you the story, but and that was great. I was feeding her, and suddenly she brings 3 babies with her. So we took them all out and got them fixed so they will not continue that gene pool. But we're feeding them every day. I'm going to bring you pictures of them next week because they're very cute. And you'll see why we did what we did. So, all right. Thanks for coming out, and hope to see you next week.
Open the door. The Spirit pour. Open your mind. Seek and you will find. And open your heart. It's not so very hard. When you open your mind, open your heart, open the door. Release and let go. Let the Spirit flow. Release and you'll see all that you can be. Peace you will find. creation. Show us heaven is here on earth. Fill us with elation. Help us know our worth and open our eyes. Help us realize and open our lives to the power of the Christ, and open our souls, for love is in control. When we open our minds, open our hearts, open the door. Show us heaven is here on earth. Fill us with elation. Help us know our worth and open our eyes. Help us realize and open our lives to the power of the Christ, and open our souls, for love is in control. When we open our minds, open our hearts, open the door. Open our minds, open our hearts, open the door. Open our minds, open our hearts, open the door.
You've been watching a talk given by Reverend Doug Bottorff here at Independent Unity in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us spread our message. If you would like to support us, you can do so by clicking the button in the right-hand corner of the video screen. We greatly appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching.